In the autumn of the year 1271 were the steps taken by 3 Venetian merchants toward the freezing peaks of the Pamir Mountains and the deadly sands of the Taklamakan Desert, merely a simple desire for commercial exploration? Or was the direction of history determined not by winds and waves, but by that massive intercontinental data transfer, organized directly by the order of the papal authority, where intelligence data gathered from the depths of Asia leaked from a damp prison cell in Genoa, ultimately drawing the route of Christopher Columbus? For centuries, historiography has popularized Marco Polo's Asian journey within the framework of a fairy tale traveler's personal bewilderment and romantic travel literature. However, the forensic records and cartographic data of the era rely on a cold geopolitical mechanics, completely stripped of emotions. In this massive academic analysis, fictional myths will be entirely set aside, and a pure evaluation of logistics, thermodynamics, and cartography will be reflected on the screen. We begin the process with the route of the Polo family, departing from the port of Accra as the official envoys of Pope Gregory X. The forced redirection of the route toward the harshest continental masses of Asia due to the structural weaknesses of the Arab ships, the caravan encountered at the port of Hormuz, the hypoxia devastation caused by the atmospheric pressure drop in the 4,000-meter-high Pamir Mountains, and the ruthless mathematics of water rationing in the Taklamakan Desert will be examined with millimetric precision. But this struggle for survival was merely a beginning. What awaited them in the depths of Asia were not the dog-headed men told in legends, but a massive machine of state capitalism that left the primitive feudal structure of 13th century Europe centuries behind. In this system, witnessed by Marco Polo, who was integrated into the Semoran bureaucracy as an official state inspector, fluent in 4 languages, the urban anatomy of the mega-capital Kublai, possessing a mathematical grid plan, will be deciphered. You will witness the mechanical operation of the Chao system, the first systematic fiat money model in history, produced from mulberry tree bark in response to the scarcity of gold and silver. How the coal extracted from the anthracite beds in the north carried Asia to a proto-industrial volume, and the flawless nervous system of the Yuan postal organization, carrying data at a speed of 400 kilometers a day. This massive cluster of information leaked into Europe when the Polo family, returning to Venice after a 24-year intelligence mission, fell captive in the Battle of Curzola in the year 1298. In the isolated cells of the Palazzo San Giorgio prison, the intersection of Polo, carrying the cold data of Asia in his mind, and Rustichello da Pisa, a writer of chivalric romances, triggered one of the greatest data leaks in history. We will reveal, with tremendous logical causality, how this book, dubbed 1 Million Lies by the European public with scholastic arrogance, was transformed into a secret navigation file by pragmatic cartographers, and how that fatal navigational error, resulting from Christopher Columbus miscalculating the volume of the Asian continent, transformed the discovery of America directly into the act of searching for Kublai Khan. But before diving into these ruthless pages of history, where 2 different eras collide over a single manuscript, a brief note. Due to our current technical phase, we unfortunately do not have direct control over the advertisements. However, to ensure that your deep focus remains unbroken and that your sleep is never interrupted in the late hours of the night, our primary goal is to take full control as soon as possible and completely eliminate all mid-roll ads. To help us accelerate this process and expand this independent archive, you can support us by liking this video and subscribing to our channel. because history is resurrected right now, in the minds of those of you listening to these words from different corners of the world, at different hours of the day. Leave your own mark on this silent anatomy table by noting down your current geography and time. If you are ready, we are starting the process towards the center of this great intelligent storm that began with the steps of Venetian merchants and extended across the oceans. The spatial perception of 13th century Europe was less a geographical reality and more a religious schematic, reflecting theological dogmas projected onto parchment. To fully comprehend the equivalent of the Asian continent in the European mind of the era, it is imperative to first examine the cartographic infrastructure of that age. The standard mapping method of the period consisted of designs classified in academia as TO maps, orbis terrarum. In these maps, the world was drawn as a circular letter O, while the T-shaped bodies of water within it, the Mediterranean Sea, the Nile River, and the Don River, divided the globe into three main continents. In these maps, where the city of Jerusalem was positioned as the absolute center of the world, namely the navel of the earth, umbilicus mundi, the Asian continent was placed at the top as the source of the East, with Europe on the bottom left and Africa on the bottom right. Devoid of any navigational value, these drawings were cosmological schematics, tailored not for merchants, but for the clergy. The most tangible and detailed manifestation of this theological geographical understanding is the massive map known as the Hereford Mappa Mundi, which flawlessly reflects the mentality of the era. Drawn on calfskin, vellum, the Asian continent on this map was populated not with the realistic coordinates of trade routes, rivers, or mountain ranges, but with mythological creatures undergoing physiological mutations as one approached its borders. For the European academics and elites of the time, the distant steppes of Asia and the vicinity of India were a dark and mythical void, a realm inhabited by dog-headed men, cynocephaly, roamed by creatures possessing a single massive leg used as an umbrella to shield them from the sun, cyopods or monopods, and ruled by headless tribes with faces on their chests, blemmies. This mythological anatomy was not a fairy tale for the European populace of the era, but an absolute zoological and geographical reality endorsed by the Church. Europe, introverted and deprived of information flow, remained in total darkness regarding the Asian territories that lay beyond the Islamic world. However, there was a singular exception to this theological isolation and intellectual darkness. The Venetian Republic, La Serenissima, rising from the waters of northern Italy. In the 13th century, Venice diverged from the classical European economic model based on feudal land ownership, transforming into a colossal financial machine entirely reliant on capital accumulation, maritime technology, intelligence networks, and pragmatic commercial diplomacy. Having seized the Byzantine ports in the Mediterranean and the Black Sea following the Fourth Crusade, 1204, Venice had established absolute commercial hegemony along the Levant, Eastern Mediterranean corridor. Venetian merchants placed their faith not in mythological legends, but in sophisticated partnership contracts known as colleganza, double-entry bookkeeping, risk analyses, and profit margins. Thus, the brothers Niccolo and Maffeo Polo were senior logisticians of a maritime empire that was highly data-driven, had institutionalized risk-taking, and had made the gathering of concrete intelligence regarding the rest of the world a matter of state policy. The grand expedition of the Polo brothers in 1271 was, in fact, not their initial contact with Asia. The foundation of this massive operation rested upon the vital data Niccolo and Maffeo had acquired from their first Asian expedition between 1260 and 1269. In 1260, the brothers crossed from the Black Sea port of Soldaya, Sudak, to Crimea for commercial purposes, and from there proceeded to the court of Berke Khan, ruler of the Golden Horde. However, with the outbreak of devastating border wars between the Ilkhanate, Hulagu Khan, and the Golden Horde, their return routes were severed, forcing the brothers to divert eastward to Bukhara. Stranded in Bukhara for exactly 3 years, the Polos experienced a diplomatic turning point. They encountered an official Mongol delegation traveling from the Ilkhanate to the Great Khan, Kublai Khan. Upon the envoy's promise of safe passage to the territories of the Great Khan for these two merchants from Europe, they joined the delegation and advanced into the heart of Asia, traveling via Karakoram all the way to Kublai Khan's headquarters. This initial contact facilitated the collection of intelligence data that would completely shatter Europe's perception of the East. The Polo brothers recorded with their own eyes that Asia was governed not by mythological creatures, but by a profoundly well-organized, colossal imperial network that printed paper money, maintained an uninterrupted postal system, and derived its authority from a single code of law, Yasa, operating under the Mongol peace, Pax Mongolica. During this first encounter, Kublai Khan viewed the Venetian brothers not merely as simple merchants, but as emissaries for a technological and diplomatic bridge to be established with the Western world, Christian Europe. The Khan issued the brothers an official decree intended for the Pope and sent them back to Europe. The Khan's request was exceptionally specific. Holy oil retrieved from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, and 100 Christian scholars to impart the science, theology, and arts of Europe to the Mongol court. This request was no mere religious curiosity. It was a strategic maneuver aimed at expanding the intellectual capacity of the massive empire. Upon returning to Venice in 1269, Niccolo and Maffeo intended to petition the papal authority to fulfill this critical diplomatic mission, only to encounter Europe's internal political crisis. Pope Clement IV had died, and the papal conclave of Viterbo, convened to elect his successor, was experiencing an unprecedented historical deadlock. The cardinal's inability to elect a new pope for 3 years delayed the Polo brothers from keeping their promise to Kublai Khan. This 3-year waiting period occasioned Niccolo Polo's first meeting with his son, Marco Polo, who had been born while Niccolo was in the East and had since turned 15, having lost his mother. Ultimately, in 1271, Teobaldo Visconti, residing in the port of Accra, was elected to the papal throne as Pope Gregory X. Immediately upon his election, the Pope examined the diplomatic letters the Polo brothers had brought from Kublai Khan and swiftly grasped the potential of this historic alliance to be forged with Asia's greatest sovereign. Although the Pope could not procure the 100 scholars requested by the Khan, only 2 Dominican friars were assigned, and they turned back in fear upon entering a war zone. He entrusted the Polo brothers with official papal letters, precious gifts, and the holy oil brought from Jerusalem to be presented to Kublai Khan. By late 1271, the logistical preparations were finalized. The convoy now included not only the 2 seasoned merchant veterans, but also the young Marco Polo, whose observational acuity was exceedingly sharp, having met his father for the first time at 15 and now being 17 years of age. Loaded with provisions, diplomatic seals, precious stones and gold coins for barter aboard the slender merchant galleys of Venice, The expedition set sail onto the waters of the Mediterranean. This movement was not the departure of a simple trade caravan. It was the genesis of an official diplomatic mission destined to shatter Europe's theological boundaries and the mythological monsters upon its maps, advancing to confront the rigid, ruthless, and highly sophisticated physical reality of Asia. By late 1271, the initial terrestrial foothold the Polo family reached after traversing the waters of the Mediterranean was the port of Acre, which stood as the last major diplomatic and military bastion of the Crusader states in the Levant. From this juncture onward, the status of the three Venetian merchants altered along unequivocal lines. The diplomatic letters received in Acre from the newly enthroned Pope Gregory X, along with the holy oil procured from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, in accordance with Kublai Khan's specific request, placed an immense political burden upon the convoy's shoulders. In order to protect the holy oil against evaporation, leakage, or physical impacts throughout a journey spanning thousands of kilometers, it had to be preserved within specially sealed receptacles. This logistical imperative became the first physical parameter to directly govern the convoy's mobility. They were no longer merely merchants pursuing profit margins, but the official couriers of the most monumental diplomatic bridge Europe would ever construct with the East. Departing from Acre, the expedition advanced northeastward into the formidable geography of Anatolia. Passing through the territories of the Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia, they penetrated the borderlands controlled by the Ilkhanate Empire. Stepping into the Iranian geography, governed by the heirs of the Mongol Emperor Hulagu Khan, meant entering the security perimeter of the Mongol military hegemony, a continental peace known as the Pax Mongolica that encompassed the entirety of Asia. However, this political security did not negate the physical ruthlessness of the terrain. The high-altitude plateaus and steep passes of eastern Anatolia, followed by the arid climate of the Iranian territories, initiated a severe test of the fundamental principles of caravan logistics. Before plunging into the massive continental depths of Asia, the two senior Venetian logistics experts, Niccolo and Maffeo Polo, had formulated a strategic and time-saving alternative route. The operational blueprint was to descend southward through Iran to the port of Hormuz, the strategic outlet of the Persian Gulf, and from there utilize a maritime route tracing the coasts of India to reach the southern ports of China. Relying on the cyclical propulsive force of the monsoon winds to reach their destination via ocean currents, rather than enduring the grueling nature of an overland journey that would span months, appeared as a flawless exercise in risk management on paper. In accordance with this strategy, the convoy descended southward through Kerman, reaching the port of Hormuz around the year 1272. Hormuz stood as one of the most highly concentrated transit hubs for the global spice and silk trade of the era. This port city, where extreme humidity merged with suffocating desert heat, was the primary artery through which goods arriving from the Indian Ocean were distributed into the Middle East. Yet upon reaching the port and inspecting the vessels they intended to charter, the Polo family encountered a structural fragility that was entirely unacceptable to minds accustomed to the exacting engineering standards of the Venetian shipyards, arsenale. In the construction of the dhow-type transport vessels of Arab and Indian origin prevalent in the region, the iron nails deemed absolutely vital for hull integrity by European mariners of the era were not utilized whatsoever. The lack of iron ore in the region, combined with local shipbuilding traditions, had given rise to a radical method for assembling the wooden hulls. Shipwrights employed fibrous ropes derived from coconut husks, known as coir, to bind the wooden planks together. Holes were bored into the timber, and the planks were literally sewn together with these rigid fibers. Local fish oils, rather than pitch or tar, were smeared between the joints to provide waterproofing. The technical assessment conducted by the Venetian merchants at the docks was unequivocally clear. These vessels, constructed merely by sewing several wooden planks together with rope and possessing only a single frail mast, carried an immense structural risk against the violent storms of the Indian Ocean and the high wave frequencies generated by cyclical monsoon winds, despite offering a certain degree of hydrodynamic flexibility. Even though coconut fibers could withstand the saline acidity of seawater to some extent, the mechanical friction forces that the planks would exert upon each other during a storm could cause the ropes to snap, leading to the vessel's instantaneous disintegration. Marco Polo, in the records he would compile later, described the condition of these ships as perilous in the extreme, reporting that boarding such structures devoid of any iron fittings was tantamount to suicide. The priceless diplomatic payload, the sacred relics, and the family's own lives were far too valuable to be entrusted to the kinetic resilience of a few pieces of timber sewn together with rope and smeared with fish oil. The logistical risk analysis was concluded, and the verdict was rendered. The maritime route was immediately aborted. Within our documentary narrative, the execution of this technical decision operates not merely as a mundane alteration of itinerary, but as the ignition switch for a cascade of catastrophes that would push human physiology to its absolute limits. The cancellation of the maritime route dictated that the convoy had to turn its back on the ocean and commence an obligatory ascent toward the most unforgiving and oxygen-deprived continental landmasses on Earth. Leaving the suffocating humidity of Hormuz behind, the Polo family shifted their trajectory at a sharp angle to the northeast. Traversing the territories of Kerman and Khorasan, they initiated a slow and irreversible ascent toward the Pamir Mountains, a region adorned with myths on contemporary maps, but which was, in reality, a zone of absolute biological devastation. The convoy's retreat from the Persian Gulf and their subsequent redirection northeastward into the deep continental interior of Asia marked the commencement of a physical endurance test unprecedented by the logistical standards of the era. Following the traversal of the Iranian plateaus, the caravan reached the Badakhshan region, located within the present-day borders of Afghanistan and Tajikistan. In the 13th century global economy, Badakhshan was a critical supply center renowned for the Balas rubies, spinel, extracted from its steep mountain slopes, and the pure lapis lazuli mines that had exported to Egypt and Mesopotamia for millennia. However, due to its rapidly elevating topography from sea level and its isolated ecosystem, this region also served as a transitional zone that exerted severe pathogenic pressures upon the human physiology of outsiders. Historical records confirm that the youngest member of the expedition, Marco Polo, contracted an endemic illness in this territory, forcing the caravan into a mandatory holding pattern that lasted for months. Modern medical geography analyses indicate that this protracted period of convalescence was likely a manifestation of severe infection caused by mountain malaria or the region's parasitic fauna. Yet this initial biological warning from nature was merely a minor prelude compared to the geographical devastation the convoy was about to confront. Upon weathering the period of illness, the caravan followed the valley of the Panj River, one of the main tributaries of the Amu Darya, Oxus, entering the Wakhan corridor and initiating their definitive ascent toward the Pamir Mountains, commonly referred to as the roof of the world. The Pamir Knot is one of the Earth's most colossal continental elevations, formed by the tectonic collision and interlocking of the Himalayas, the Karakoram, the Hindu Kush, and the Tian Shan ranges. As the convoy breached the 4,000-meter altitude threshold and stepped onto the Pamir Plateau, the parameters of the journey transcended standard caravan administration, morphing into a survival equation dictated entirely by atmospheric pressure and the laws of thermodynamics. At altitudes of 4,000 meters and above, atmospheric pressure undergoes a sharp drop from the sea level value of 1,013 millibars, HPA, to levels of approximately 600 millibars. This absolute decline signifies the distancing of oxygen molecules in the atmosphere, a radical reduction in air density. When the respiratory systems of European merchants, which were perfectly integrated with sea level conditions, were exposed to this new atmospheric reality, a process of biological collapse commenced. Defined in medical literature as hypoxia, oxygen deficiency, this condition decelerates alveolar gas exchange. As the volume of oxygen delivered by the blood to the tissues plummets below critical thresholds, the heart rate violently accelerates in a compensatory effort. Capillaries dilate, and severe headaches, spatial disorientation, muscle atrophy, catabolism, and chronic lethargy manifest in both the human and animal elements of the convoy. The risk of hypoxia-induced pulmonary and cerebral edema hovered over the caravan with every step, swinging like an invisible scythe. Yet, human respiration was not the sole casualty of low atmospheric pressure. This condition simultaneously warped the laws of thermodynamics to the caravan's detriment. The physical behavior of the fires kindled at campsites for survival, warmth, and nourishment was fundamentally altered due to oxygen deprivation. The combustion reaction, oxidation, inherently requires oxygen. The fires ignited in the rarefied atmosphere of the Pamir could generate only a minute fraction of the caloric value, thermal energy, produced by a standard fire at sea level. The flames were feeble, pale, and devoid of heat-radiating capacity. Marco Polo's observation in his travelogue that fires do not burn as brightly as they do elsewhere, nor do they give out as much heat, was not a mythological exaggeration, but an absolute physical truth. A far more critical issue was the decline in water's phase transition point, namely its boiling temperature. Water, which boils at 100 degrees Celsius at sea level, begins to boil between approximately 85 and 87 degrees Celsius at the elevations of the Pamir Plateau, exceeding 4,000 meters. This temperature is insufficient to provide the thermal energy required to break down the cellular structure of, or effectively cook, cured meats, hard grains, and legumes. Provisions kept over the fire for hours remained raw, crippling the convoy's digestive systems and driving bodies already experiencing a massive energy deficit, caloric deficit, due to cold and exhaustion, into profound malnutrition. As the organism began burning its own adipose and muscular tissues to maintain basal body temperature in sub-zero conditions, it entirely lost its compensatory mechanisms due to the indigestible nature of the food. The convoy's observations during this ordeal also recorded the ecological sterilization of the region for history. While the statement in the travelogue that no flying birds of any kind are to be seen in this region was perceived by contemporary readers as a literary exaggeration depicting desolation, modern aerodynamics and biological sciences corroborate this finding. In order for birds to generate aerodynamic lift by flapping their wings, they require a specific air density. The ultra-low density air of the Pamir invalidates the flight mechanics of numerous avian species. Furthermore, on these massive glacial plateaus where vegetation and insect populations are entirely zeroed out, it is ecologically impossible for any bird to secure a food chain. The convoy was marching through an absolute void where the limits of the biosphere literally ceased to exist, and organic life had been frozen out of existence. This ecological void imposed a terrifying mathematical weight upon the logistics of the caravan. The traversal of the Pamir Knot took exactly 40 days. For 40 days, there was no human settlement, no oasis, no pasture, and no supply point. This circumstance mandated that the convoy load a full 40-day stockpile of provisions necessary for both themselves and their beasts of burden at the very inception of the journey. The vast majority of the carrying capacity was allocated not to commercial trade goods, but to the fodder and sustenance that would literally fuel the expedition. The primary transport engines of the caravan, the Central Asian Bactrian camels, Camelus bactrianus, were the most suitable biological machines for this task, with their thick wool coats and physiologies capable of withstanding temperatures plunging to negative 30 degrees Celsius. Yet even they possessed biological limits. Every pack animal that slipped on icy slopes and plummeted into ravines, froze to death from extreme cold, or suffered cardiac arrest due to hypoxia, meant that its 150-kilogram payload had to be transferred to other animals or directly onto the backs of humans. This risk of a cascading logistical collapse acted as a lethal countdown timer, requiring the caravan to meet its daily distance objectives down to the second. This physiological devastation, enduring for days, eroded not only physical endurance but also psychological resilience. This dead zone, where no sound was heard save for the monotonous howl of the wind striking icy rocks, stretched the convoy's nervous systems to their absolute limits. However, the Venetian couriers did not halt. At the conclusion of this 40-day white inferno, they reached the point where the atmospheric pressure gradually began to rise as they initiated their descent toward the eastern foothills of the mountains. The Pamir Knot had been physically surmounted, but the geography awaiting them below in the east was the second most lethal barrier on Earth, where ice would be replaced by scorching sand. Leaving behind the oxygen-deprived, lethal glacial plateaus of the Pamir Knot provided no physiological reprieve for the Venetian convoy. Rather, nature merely exchanged its weaponry. As the caravan descended eastward from the mountainous massif and entered the colossal geological depression of the Tarim Basin, atmospheric pressure began to normalize, but the atmospheric humidity ratio plummeted to near absolute zero. This new topography, situated at the very heart of the Asian continent, and isolated by the Himalayas and Karakoram to the south, the Pamirs to the west, and the Tian Shan to the north, is a massive reactor of aridity. Defined in geographical sciences as the rain shadow effect, this phenomenon operates through a mechanism where moist air masses arriving from the oceans collide with high mountain ranges, precipitating their moisture and allowing only scorching, dry winds to reach the basin. The immense mass confronting them was the Taklamakan Desert, a name which in the local tongue translates to "he who goes in does not come out." The Taklamakan is not a static geography, but a realm of fluid dynamics constantly shifting via the kinetic energy of the wind. Colossal sand dunes known as barchans, which occasionally exceed 200 meters in height, can relocate within hours as a result of aeolian, wind-driven erosion processes. This condition entirely obliterates the navigational memory that constitutes the most fundamental security element in caravan logistics. The tracks left by previous caravans are erased by the first gust of wind. Navigation techniques reliant on fixed topographical features or landmarks are rendered completely obsolete in the Taklamakan. Consequently, the convoy was compelled to chart a rigidly unforgiving route of progression, strictly dependent on the compass and the angular position of the sun. The trajectory followed by the caravan skirted the southern boundary of the desert rather than penetrating its lethal center, tracing the southern corridor of the historic Silk Road that linked the oasis cities, Yarkant, Khotan, and Churchen, arrayed along the foothills of the Tarim Basin. However, within the logistical reality of the era, the concept of an oasis was not a succession of closely spaced, easily accessible verdant havens, as commonly presumed. The distances between Yarkant and Khotan, or from Khotan to the subsequent water source, encompassed zones of absolute drought that required days to traverse. In an equation where Bactrian caravan camels, encumbered by their payload, could cover a maximum of 25 to 30 kilometers per day, a 10-day march between two oases reduced survival to a pure mathematical problem. The greatest unknown in this mathematical problem was the desert's thermodynamic violence. Due to the lack of moisture in the region, the thermal capacity of the Taklamakan Desert oscillates between radical extremes. Because the air lacks water's property to trap and stabilize heat, solar radiation strikes the sand surface directly during the day, driving the ambient temperature above 45 degrees Celsius. When night falls, the absence of any cloud cover or moisture layer to retain the accumulated surface heat causes it to rapidly radiate back into the vacuum of space, plunging the temperature on the desert floor to sub-zero levels within mere hours. The biological thermoregulation system of the human body is pushed to the brink of collapse in the face of this destructive thermal fluctuation, expanding and contracting across a daily span of 80 degrees. While blood plasma volume drops precipitously during the day due to profuse sweating, the heart continues to pump violently at night to stave off hypothermia. Under this physiological duress, water rationing is not merely a discipline, it is a chronometer of life and death. For an adult human to sustain basal organ functions under Taklamakan conditions, a minimum intake of 6 to 8 liters of fluid per day is required. When the total number of human and animal members in the convoy is multiplied by the number of days between oases, the resulting colossal water payload pushed the limits of the pack animal's capacity. The water contained within leather flasks, tulum, grew stagnant over the days, suffered evaporation losses, and practically boiled in the high desert heat. In the event that the water ration fell below the calculated milliliters, the process of medical dehydration proceeded second by second. The initial phase involves cellular water loss. Subsequently, the salivary glands run dry. Renal functions cease filtering toxic urea. The blood thickens to the consistency of sludge, and the flow of oxygen to the brain is interrupted. The probability of rescuing a caravan member who has entered this stage of physiological collapse in the desert is absolute zero. The Venetian couriers were forced to dictate their every step according to this hair-splitting hydro-mathematical calculation. Beyond physical destruction, severe dehydration also triggers neurological devastation, giving rise to the infamous, legendary mythology of the Taklamakan. The phenomena that Marco Polo elaborated upon in his memoirs, which Europeans categorized as evil spirits, invisible phantom armies, or demons calling out names, are, when examined under the lens of modern science, the result of a perfectly explicable physical and psychological mechanism. The source of these auditory illusions is a natural phenomenon known in acoustic physics as singing sands. When desert winds mobilize dunes of a specific inclination and aridity, millions of silica particles slide and rub against one another. This mechanical friction generates low frequency, approximately 60 to 105 Hz, and high decibel acoustic emissions. Depending on wind velocity and dune morphology, these sounds can mimic the distant rhythm of drums, the approach of galloping hooves, human murmurs, or the clashing of swords. Upon hearing these low-frequency acoustic waves, the auditory cortices of caravan members, who had been marching for over 30 days, suffering from profound sleep deprivation, REM sleep deficiency, exposed to extreme thermal stress, and whose brain chemistry was compromised by diminished blood plasma volume, matched these sounds with familiar perils. A member lagging mere meters behind the main group would perceive these echoing sounds carried by the wind as their own name being called, deviating from the route to follow the source into the depths of the desert, never to be seen again. Marco Polo reported that, as a rule of caravan logistics, strict discipline was enforced. No individual was permitted to separate from the main group. Bells were attached to the animals' necks to prevent falling asleep during night marches, and a regime of absolute silence and close tracking was maintained. This mechanical march, accompanied by bone-chilling sandstorms exceeding 30 days, lip-cracking dehydration, repetitive daily water measurements, and the acoustic torture of the wind, finally gave way to a new reality upon reaching the eastern exit of the Tarim Basin. Although the hypoxic cold of the mountains and the scorching inferno of the desert had exhausted the convoy's biological endurance to its very last drop, they had survived to reach the borders of the Gobi Desert. The natural barriers of the earth had now ceased. They had stepped into the territories directly controlled by Kublai Khan, within the borders of the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace, the largest and most disciplined military machine humanity had ever witnessed. With the surmounting of the most ruthless biological and geological barriers constructed by nature, the caravan was now confronted by the most colossal and integrated political mechanism forged by human hands that the earth has witnessed. As the Venetian diplomatic delegation advanced from the eastern extremities of the Taklamakan toward the foothills of the Gobi Desert, they ceased to be an isolated and vulnerable convoy. They were integrated into the absolute security network of the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol military order that united Asia under a single administrative umbrella from the Pacific coast to Eastern Europe. This peace was not born of diplomatic courtesy, but was a security protocol fueled by the relentless and draconian policing policies enforced by the Mongol cavalry units. Because the security of trade routes was deemed the lifeblood of the empire, the penalty for crimes committed along these arteries was, without exception, death. In this new geography, the Venetian struggle for logistical survival yielded to the observation of a massive infrastructure predicated on speed and data transmission. The sole element that guaranteed the convoy's immunity and logistical resupply within these territories was the diplomatic transit tablets known as paisa, gerege, which had been bestowed upon the Polo brothers by Kublai Khan during their initial journey in 1269. Forged of gold and silver and bearing the direct decree of the Khan engraved in the Mongol administrative script of the era, these tablets served as absolute diplomatic visas, granting the bearer the authority to requisition all resources within the imperial borders. By virtue of this tablet, the Polo convoy made direct contact with the YAM organization, an infrastructure as advanced as the logistical networks of the modern age. The YAM system constituted the fastest and most synchronized data processing and cargo network of the 13th century world. Along the primary commercial and military arteries, relay stations known as yamjan were established every 40 to 50 kilometers. At each station, hundreds of fresh horses, shelters, supply depots, and specially trained expert riders were kept at the ready. Couriers, galloping ceaselessly and adorned with bells, would broadcast their approach as they neared a station. The attendants would transfer the saddle and documents to a fresh mount in a matter of seconds, allowing the courier to continue without deceleration. Through this system, a military directive or intelligence report issuing from Kublai Khan's headquarters could be transmitted to the farthest corners of the empire at velocities approaching 400 kilometers per day. For the European merchants, witnessing the physiological exhaustion limits of horses being bypassed by such a rationalized shift system delivered the first major shockwave regarding the administrative capacity of the era. Leaving the southern borders of the Gobi Desert behind, the caravan pushed across the northern plateaus of China, beyond the provinces of Shaanxi and Hebei, devouring the final kilometers toward their destination. Finally, in the summer of 1275, exactly 3.5 years after their departure, the convoy arrived at Chengdu, Xanadu, the summer capital of Kublai Khan. The succession of oceans, mountains, snow, and desert spanning thousands of kilometers, which had commenced at the port of Accra, terminated at this precise coordinate. The Chengdu headquarters loomed before the convoy as the most tangible architectural evidence of a nomadic empire's metamorphosis into a sedentary superpower. For merchants accustomed to the cramped canals and narrow stone edifices of Venice, the scale of Chengdu lay far beyond the limits of their comprehension. Encircled by massive walls exceeding 25 kilometers in perimeter, this complex was not merely a palace, but an administrative city possessing its own ecosystem. Within the walls lay vast pastures, artificial lakes, and hunting grounds where deer and exotic fauna roamed freely. At the epicenter of the complex rose the colossal main palace, constructed of marble and gold, its walls adorned with depictions of birds and beasts. Yet, the true zenith of architectural ingenuity was the dismantleable summer palace standing adjacent to this stone structure, constructed of massive bamboo canes, anchored to the earth with silk ropes, and serving as an homage to the emperor's nomadic origins. This structure was designed with the flexibility to be disassembled and relocated by hundreds of laborers when necessary, while retaining the volumetric capacity to house thousands of individuals. The presentation of Niccolo, Maffeo, and the young Marco Polo before Kublai Khan was not an emotional reunion ritual, but a diplomatic transaction governed by ponderous state protocol. In the immense hall of the palace, amidst an atmosphere where thousands of guards, administrators, and envoys were arrayed in rigid hierarchy and absolute silence, the three Europeans approached the Khan's throne. The Mongol emperor verified that the promise previously made to him had been honored. The official diplomatic letters of Pope Gregory X, along with the seals of the holy oil, transported from Jerusalem through myriad logistical tribulations without suffering volumetric loss, were delivered to the Khan. This delivery transcended a simple exchange. The theological and diplomatic codes of the Mediterranean basin and the colossal administrative and military reality of Asia established concrete, physical contact within the same room. This logistical operation, which commenced in 1271 and pushed human physiology, the carrying capacities of the era, and cartographic knowledge to their absolute limits had been successfully concluded and sealed. The physical journey was now over, but the floodgates of intercontinental data transfer, which would irrevocably alter the 13th century world through knowledge and innovation, were thrown wide open. The data gathered within the court of Kublai Khan would, in the ensuing years, lay the groundwork for the construction of an entirely new paradigm that would fundamentally shatter all the economic and geographical dogmas of Europe. In the summer of 1275, the Venetian convoy's departure from Kublai Khan's summer headquarters of Shangdu, Xanadu, and their entry into the winter capital of Dadu, known among the Turkic and Persian-speaking peoples of the era as Kambalik, city of the Khan, was not a mere geographical relocation. It was a historic breaking point that certified Europe's urban primitivism in the face of Asia's urban planning and administrative capacity. The urban fabric of 13th century Europe consisted of an entirely organic, unplanned chaos devoid of engineering, shaped around the property lines of feudal lordships and the church. Considered the greatest European metropolises of the era, cities like Paris or Venice, with populations hovering around 100 to 150,000, had deteriorated into massive epidemiological incubators. Their narrow, asymmetrical streets that obstructed sunlight from reaching the ground, and their open sewer systems that discharged waste directly onto the thoroughfares, fostered the proliferation of fatal infectious diseases such as cholera and dysentery. While European cities bore the characteristics of vulnerable agglomerations susceptible to natural phenomena and population surges, Dadu, forming the foundations of modern Beijing in the east, was constructed as the petrified embodiment of mathematical order, hydraulic engineering, and centralized state authority. Designed from scratch in 1267 by Kublai Khan's chief architect, Liu Bingzhong, according to the principles articulated in the Caogong-ji Record of Trades, which harbored classical Chinese urban philosophy, the city of Dadu possessed a flawless grid plan resembling a colossal chessboard. The city's perimeter was encircled by massive walls constructed of rammed earth, extending approximately 29 kilometers in length, punctuated by 11 main gates positioned according to astronomical alignments. The spectacle that greeted the Venetian diplomatic delegation upon stepping into the city presented a geometry unimaginable to the European mindset of the era. The boulevards constituting the city's main arteries were so broad and linear that an observer entering through one gate could clearly see the corresponding gate kilometers away without encountering a single obstruction. These grand avenues were designed to be 24 paces wide, while the intersecting alleyways, hutong, were narrowed at a strict mathematical ratio, connecting neighborhoods with definitive lines. However, Dadu's architectural supremacy lay not merely in the width of its streets, but within its subterranean infrastructure. Through the hydraulic system designed by the engineer Guo Shoujing, fresh water channeled from the Jade Spring Mountain was integrated into the city's artificial lakes, the palace complex, and the final terminal of the Grand Canal. While raw sewage flowed through the centers of European cities, the stone-capped drainage canals and wastewater evacuation systems, situated beneath Dadu's wide boulevards, ensured the hygiene of a massive population, approaching 1 million with mechanical precision. Yet beneath this monumental engineering marvel lay a socio-political engineering far more complex than physical stone and water. Kublai Khan's relocation of the Mongol Empire's epicenter from Karakoram to Chinese territories, and his founding of the Yuan dynasty, had necessitated the management of one of the greatest demographic asymmetries in history. How were the Mongols, a nomadic and military minority numbering only a few 100,000, to govern the sedentary, agrarian Han Chinese populace, which numbered in the tens of millions and possessed a deeply entrenched bureaucratic tradition. China's millennial administrative tradition had cultivated a local elite class, literati, selected through civil service examinations, keju, grounded in classical Confucian texts. In an effort to shatter the bureaucratic power of this local elite and consolidate his own absolute authority, Kublai Khan abolished the traditional examination system and fractured the empire into a rigid, four-tiered racial and legal hierarchy. At the zenith of this caste system resided the Mongols, the absolute masters of the military and the state. The second and most critical stratum was the class of foreigners designated as Semuran, translating to people of colored eyes or various categories, composed of Uyghurs, Tibetans, Arabs, Persians, Turkic peoples and Europeans. This stratum was an army of technocrats imported from all corners of the globe to operate the administrative, financial, and intelligence infrastructure of the empire. The third tier comprised the northern Han Chinese, whereas the lowest and most distrusted stratum consisted of the southern Chinese, Nanren, the subjects of the recently conquered southern Song dynasty. Marco Polo's position at the court of Kublai Khan was unequivocally not that of a charming Western guest retained by the Khan to recount exotic tales, as popular history often claims. Stepping into Asia at the age of 17 and developing an unparalleled memory and observational acumen throughout his 3.5-year journey, the young Marco was promptly identified by Kublai Khan's pragmatic statecraft and integrated into this massive bureaucratic machine of the Yuan dynasty as an official civil servant of the Semuran class. A foreigner devoid of any kinship, tribal or vested interests with local Chinese power factions, stood as the most reliable tax inspector and intelligence gatherer for the empire. As the son of a Venetian merchant family, Marco possessed a mindset inherently attuned to profit margins, logistical costs, and data analysis. This disposition aligned him flawlessly with the Khan's model of state capitalism. The initial phase of this integration process involved rigorous linguistic and administrative training. During his formative years at the court, Marco Polo was not compelled to learn Chinese, the language of the local populace, for Chinese was not the official administrative language of the state. As a member of the Semuran class, he was required to decipher the true administrative codes of the empire. To this end, Marco acquired Mongolian, the native tongue of the ruling elite, Persian, the lingua franca of Silk Road commerce, international diplomacy, and Muslim financial officers, and the Uyghur script, utilized in the official bureaucratic correspondence of the state. His transformation into a state inspector, capable of fluently speaking, reading, and writing 4 languages, formed the technical foundation of his ascension within the court. Upon completing his training, Marco Polo was dispatched to provinces thousands of kilometers from Khanbalik under the title of Darugachi, or Special Imperial Inspector. His mandate was to audit whether local administrators were fulfilling their tax quotas, to inspect the operations of the salt and iron monopolies, to report on the status of provisions within the army's logistical depots, and to directly notify the Khan of any indications of rebellion in distant provinces. Unlike Chinese bureaucrats, his compilation of reports based entirely on concrete data, numerical figures, resources, and strategic analyses, rather than traditional Confucian moral texts, perfectly harmonized with Kublai Khan's data-driven governance paradigm. Marco Polo penetrated so deeply into the system that he served for 3 years as the governor of Yangzhou, a massive hub of commerce and salt production. While Europe was enduring a dark age where feudal lords waged war against one another, taxation was extracted by force of arms, and the concept of state bureaucracy had not yet been fully institutionalized. This Cimmerian bureaucracy, where meritorious foreigners of diverse races and religions governed a massive continent with mathematical precision, utilizing a common bureaucratic language, served as the first great shock of vision that completely astounded the Venetians. This administrative machine operating within the colossal walls of Canbalik would subsequently alter the very nature of physical matter, laying the groundwork for the creation of an entirely new economic paradigm that Europe would only comprehend centuries later: paper money. The fundamental problem of 13th century global trade networks stemmed not from the production capacity of goods, but from the physical nature of the medium of exchange, money, that facilitated the transfer of these goods. While standardized gold and silver coinage, such as the Venetian ducat or the Florentine florin, represented Europe's commercial reliability, they simultaneously functioned as a straitjacket, suffocating the continent's macroeconomic growth. In this economic model of feudal Europe, which could be termed bullionism, the value of money was strictly equal to the physical, intrinsic market value of the metal from which it was minted. The inevitable and fatal consequence of this system was that a state's economy could only expand as far as the physical reserves of gold and silver mines within its borders permitted. The bottlenecking of metal supply led to the contraction of commercial volume, severe deflationary pressures, and an appalling logistical cost wherein international merchants were forced to protect crates of silver weighing tons against hordes of bandits across thousands of kilometers. While the European mindset remained fixated on the dogma that value could only be found in rare and heavy metals, deep within Asia, in the Yuan dynasty's capital of Canbalik, the world's first systematic fiat currency model was initiated, wherein money was stripped of its physical materiality and transformed into an entirely abstract covenant of trust based on legal and state authority. In this colossal economic laboratory under the administration of Kublai Khan, the source of value was not metals extracted from beneath the earth, but the absolute authority of the emperor himself. Acting with the logic of a modern central bank president, Kublai Khan implemented the national paper currency system in the year 1260, known formally as Zhongtong Yuan Bao Jiao Chao, and historically abbreviated as Chao. The production of this paper currency was no ordinary stationary process. It was a botanical and chemical engineering endeavor conducted on the scale of heavy industry under state monopoly. The supply of raw materials for the mints in Canbalik relied on the highly specific processing of the white mulberry tree, Morus alba, which also formed the foundation of sericulture in the Chinese geography. Botanically, the inner bark, phloem layer, the nutrient-transporting tissue of the plant located immediately beneath the bark, was harvested. This finely fibrous layer was boiled in massive cauldrons of water to soften and subsequently beaten for hours with wooden mallets until it was reduced to a smooth cellulose pulp. This resulting pulp was strained through bamboo sieves, transformed into sheets of paper, and dried. However, for this organic material to be converted into an official state bond, it had to undergo the most advanced printing technology and chemical sealing processes of the era. The dried sheets of mulberry paper were cut into standardized rectangular dimensions, representing various nominal values. Utilizing the woodblock printing technique, The value of the currency, for instance, 10 taels of silver, the endorsement of the imperial treasury, and a warning against counterfeiting were stamped onto the money using black ink. Yet the element that bestowed the currency with its true legal status and value was the massive red imperial seals stamped over the black ink. The ink utilized for these seals was no ordinary pigment. It was vermilion red, derived from a mineral found in nature as mercury sulfide, HGS, known as cinnabar. This toxic and vivid red hue, obtained by crushing and processing cinnabar ore, belonged exclusively to the imperial office, and its use by the civilian populace was strictly forbidden. The moment the vermilion seal was pressed onto the paper, that single gram of mulberry bark was transfigured into genuine wealth, backed by the armies, the laws, and the colossal economy of the empire. When Marco Polo examined this system in his capacity as a state inspector, the reports he authored characterized this phenomenon as a triumph of alchemy. While the medieval alchemists of Europe squandered their lives in vain, attempting to transmute base metals like lead and copper into gold within their furnaces, Kublai Khan had successfully transmuted tree bark into pure purchasing power through the apparatus of a massive bureaucratic mechanism. The statistical and procedural analyses found within Marco Polo's travelogue flawlessly elucidate the economic infrastructure of this alchemy. Initially, the system was not a machine for printing unbacked currency, hyperinflation. The Chao was supported by a solid backing comprised of massive bales of silk and silver ingots held within the imperial treasuries, central bank reserves. The Yuan dynasty's method of ensuring macroeconomic control relied upon an extraordinarily rigid foreign exchange regime. No foreign merchant, be they Persian, Arab, or European, entering the imperial territories through the border gates was permitted to conduct direct trade in the Chinese market using the gold, silver, pearls, or precious stones they had brought with them. All foreign merchants were obligated to surrender their precious metals directly to the state's official exchange bureaus, treasury representations. In return, they were issued Chao, paper money, after a commission was deducted based on the exchange rate determined by the state. Through this system, the state centralized all precious metal reserves in the country, accumulating them in its treasury. Meanwhile, merchants could purchase silk, porcelain, and spices in every corner of the empire using paper currency that was exceptionally light to carry and possessed near zero logistical risk. The sole foundation that kept this fiat currency system standing without collapsing was the uncompromising brutality of imperial law, yasa. The principle that the true guardian of a paper currency's value is the military might standing behind it operated as an absolute law of physics in Yuan China. The penalty for any individual who refused to accept the paper money, engaged in clandestine trade using gold, or attempted to forge the currency, counterfeiting, was prescribed as immediate execution, decapitation, irrespective of their social status. Furthermore, an informant who turned in a counterfeiter was rewarded with the counterfeiter's entire estate, supplemented by a substantial bounty of silver from the state treasury. This mechanism of self-policing and informants statistically reduced the rate of forgery to near zero. Meanwhile, currency that had become torn or illegible due to prolonged circulation could be exchanged for crisp new banknotes at the mints for a nominal destruction commission of 3%. For a merchant and diplomat hailing from Venice, Europe's most advanced financial center, the fact that a silver fortune requiring hundreds of heavy wagons to transport had been transmuted into stacks of paper capable of fitting inside a single pillow and unconditionally accepted across an entire continent, was an innovation that pushed the boundaries of human comprehension. By liberating money from its physical weight, Kublai Khan elevated the velocity of money to a frequency never before witnessed in the world, forging a proto-industrial consumer society. The energy fueling this macroeconomic revolution, however, was derived from another material whose surface Europe had only just begun to scratch, but which China was already extracting in massive tonnages from hundreds of meters beneath the earth. The burning black stones that trap the millennial energy of the sun within their chemical bonds. In the 13th century, the physical growth capacity of the European economy was constrained not only by the financial contraction generated by bullionism, but also by a thermodynamic bottleneck, namely, a chronic energy and fuel crisis. The sole energy source upon which the European continent relied for both demographic heating requirements and fundamental artisanal productions such as metallurgy and glassmaking was unprocessed biomass, wood. However, wood inherently possessed a low energy density. The timber fuel utilized in the furnaces of the era could generate an average of 15 megajoules of energy per kilogram, simultaneously diminishing its own thermal efficiency by emitting massive volumes of water vapor and smoke during the combustion process. Furthermore, when the fuel demands of blacksmiths' furnaces converged with a growing population's need for heat and construction materials, the European continent began to face a catastrophic deforestation crisis by the 13th century. This disequilibrium between energy demand and ecological capacity effectively paralyzed Europe's pre-industrial production volume, condemning iron manufacturing to the scale of small workshops. In stark contrast, in the east of Asia, within the borders of the Yuan dynasty, ruled by Kublai Khan, an unparalleled thermodynamic revolution was taking place. This phenomenon would be recorded with immense astonishment in Marco Polo's travelogue as black stones dug out of the mountains like ore, found in veins, which burn and give off much more heat than logs. These black stones, of which a Venetian merchant had previously been entirely unaware, were high-carbon anthracite and bituminous coal extracted from massive deposits in the northern geography of China, particularly in the Shaanxi province. Having completed the carbonization process under millions of years of geological pressure and heat, this fossil fuel constituted a limitless and unparalleled source of power for China's state-sponsored macroeconomy. The supremacy that coal bestowed upon the Asian production line rested directly upon the laws of chemistry and thermodynamics. When ignited, 1 kilogram of high-quality Chinese anthracite released a calorific capacity of approximately 30 to 35 megajoules per kilogram, more than double the thermal energy wood could produce. Unlike wood, coal did not momentarily flare and extinguish when cast into the fire. It provided a slow, stable, and exceptionally high-temperature thermal radiation over long hours, impervious to ambient external temperatures. This intense and constant heat directly enabled the establishment of an industrial infrastructure that redrew the boundaries of material science. While iron in Europe could only be heated in small crucibles using charcoal and shaped by hammer blows, wrought iron, the colossal heat provided by these subterranean black stones in China enabled high-capacity blast furnaces to reach 1500 degrees Celsius, the melting point of iron. Consequently, Chinese metallurgical engineers transitioned to the production of cast iron, by pouring liquefied iron into molds, achieving a proto-industrial level that yielded, in a single production season, tens of times the total amount of iron produced by the entirety of Europe in the 13th century. However, the extraction of coal and its high thermal capacity would have held no economic significance had this material not been deliverable to furnaces in every corner of the empire. It was at this precise juncture that the Grand Canal, Jinghang, the most colossal logistical operation of the state capitalism implemented by the Yuan dynasty, came into play. The coal mines, iron furnaces, and massive grain silos of the north were connected to the production and population centers of the south via the Grand Canal, the world's largest man-made waterway, extending approximately 1,700 kilometers in length. Upon this logistical network, which Marco Polo admired with his statistical mindset, tens of thousands of flat-bottomed, massive tonnage barges shuttled ceaselessly between north and south, towed from the banks by ropes when wind proved insufficient. By nullifying the wheel friction and animal fodder costs, caloric consumption, inherent in overland transport, this hydraulic logistics network drastically reduced the cost of the black stones, delivering coal to even the most ordinary neighborhoods in the capital, Dadu. The reflection of this thermodynamic and logistical integration on the daily life of the populace established a standard of social hygiene unimaginable to European elites. In his travelogue, Marco Polo reported with profound astonishment that the massive public bathhouses in the capital Dadu and other major cities were filled with boiling water 24 hours a day, every day of the week. The affordability of coal and its capacity to burn for hours without extinguishing allowed the fires beneath the massive water cauldrons to be maintained for months on end. In an era where bathing in warm water in Europe was an extreme luxury and an arduous process that only the nobility could attain by having massive piles of wood burned, the fact that even ordinary peasants and laborers in Asia could bathe 3 times a week in massive pools heated by coal fires stood as the most definitive proof of cheap energy translating into social welfare. This system, wherein mineral fuel extracted from beneath the earth was distributed under state control via massive waterways to feed iron foundries, bathhouses and porcelain kilns, had forged the most complex and integrated proto-industrial machine of the 13th century world. Yet this synchronized operation of mines, rivers, and factories required another apparatus to enable the empire to be managed simultaneously from a single center. It necessitated an absolute bureaucratic nervous system capable of transporting massive volumes of data, orders, and reports across the continent at blinding speed. The geographical movement of information in 13th century Europe possessed a nature as fragmented, sluggish, and profoundly insecure as the continent's political structure. Due to the customs borders of feudal fiefdoms, mud-caked and neglected roads, the absence of a central authority, and bandit factions lying in ambush within every forest, an official dispatch sent from Paris to Rome required weeks, sometimes months, to reach its destination. Information was an isolated entity, its progression contingent upon the daily marching pace of the horse or pedestrian bearing it, meteorological conditions, and pure chance. Conversely, for the Yuan dynasty, compelled to govern from a single center, a colossal continental mass spanning tens of millions of square kilometers from the Pacific Ocean to the steppes of Eastern Europe, the velocity of data was the sole absolute element ensuring the empire's survival. The state capitalism and bureaucratic machine implemented by Kublai Khan could only endure through the uninterrupted operation of the chain of command between the center and the provinces. The infrastructure that anatomically coordinated this massive landmass was the Yam Postal and Intelligence Organization, engineered as the biological nervous system of the empire. Far transcending mere postal transport, the Yam system was a masterwork of logistical engineering, constructed entirely upon mathematical and biological thresholds. The primary backbone of the system relied upon a network of relay stations designated as Jamb or Yamb, erected every 40 kilometers, approximately 25 miles, along all major commercial and military arteries of China. This 40-kilometer interval was not an arbitrarily determined architectural preference. It represented the maximum physiological limit a horse could sprint at a full gallop before the accumulation of lactic acid in its muscles, the breaching of its aerobic threshold, reached lethal levels. The empire had calculated the biological exhaustion points of equines with millimeter precision, subdividing the map into parcels according to this biological equation. According to the audit reports prepared by Marco Polo in his capacity as a state inspector, over 10,000 of these stations were situated within the imperial borders. These edifices were constructed not only across desolate steppes or mountain passes, but even within boundless deserts devoid of any human settlement. The major stations at critical junctions were not mere stables. They were massive complexes housing royal pavilions, furnished with silk beds for the accommodation of envoys and couriers, colossal grain silos, repair workshops, and military garrisons. To ensure the system operated at maximum capacity at all times, the number of horses financed by the imperial budget and kept perpetually ready at these stations exceeded 300,000. To sustain these animals, millions of tons of oats and barley were systematically dispatched to these stations via the Grand Canal or through military caravans. The operational execution of the Yam network possessed a martial rhythm that reduced time loss to mere seconds. A mounted courier bearing an extremely urgent military directive, tax report, or intelligence of rebellion would don specially designed tight-fitting garments and wrap their head to minimize aerodynamic drag. Yet, the courier's most vital equipment was the cluster of massive brass bells affixed to their waist. As the courier approached within a few kilometers of a station, the clamor of the bells, violently shaken by the galloping horse, would be carried to the station by the wind. Thanks to this acoustic early warning system, the station's hostlers anticipated the courier's arrival minutes in advance, immediately leading a rested, fully energized, and saddled fresh mount into the courtyard. The moment the courier entered the station, they would dismount before the horse had fully decelerated, transfer the documents to the saddle of the new mount in seconds, and propel forward at a gallop on the fresh horse without expending a single minute to rest. The operation never ceased at nightfall. To guide the couriers, station personnel illuminated the subsequent route with torches, ensuring the sound of bells continued to echo across the steppes, even on the blackest, moonless nights. Through this relentless biological rotation and the principle of zero time loss, a journey that would normally require days for a single horse was shattered by exploiting the physiology of hundreds of different mounts. Facilitated by this system, the empire's most critical decrees attained velocities of 400 kilometers, 250 miles per day, a speed unmatched by any terrestrial transportation in human history until the invention of steam locomotives and the telegraph in the 19th century. While a letter languished for weeks on the muddy roads of Europe, a command issued by Kublai Khan in Dadu could reach the Tibetan borders or the forests of Manchuria, thousands of kilometers away, within a single week. However, for this colossal machine to function, security along the routes and the courier's right-of-way had to be enforced through absolute terror, namely, Mongol law, yasa. The legal immunity of a courier within the Yam system was secured by the tablets they bore, known as paisa, gerege, engraved with imperial seals and the inscription, "By the strength of the eternal heaven, he who does not obey the Khan's command shall die." These gold, silver, or iron tablets endowed the bearer directly with the physical authority of Kublai Khan. As a courier bearing a paisa advanced along the road, the armies of the highest-ranking generals, the caravans of the nobility, or even tax collectors, were compelled to yield immediately. Should the courier's horse collapse from cardiac arrest en route, the rider possessed the authority to requisition the mount of any passerby, even a prince, at that exact second. The penalty for obstructing a courier, refusing to surrender a horse, or pillaging supplies from a postal station was instantaneous execution, devoid of any judicial process. These draconian laws prevented the empire's nervous system from suffering blockages. The Yam network did not consist solely of mounted couriers. A more specific micro-scale network documented in Marco Polo's records was the foot couriers, runners system. In contrast to the equestrian stations, smaller relay posts were erected every 5 kilometers, approximately 3 miles. Across these shorter distances, specialized runners, selected for their athletic physiques and adorned with massive bells at their waists, were deployed. As a runner executing a 5-kilometer sprint heralded their approach, the subsequent runner would snatch the dispatch mid-stride and continue the race. This pedestrian system functioned as a secondary logistical network, utilized specifically for the rapid transmission of regional bureaucratic correspondence, or for delivering luxury consumables, such as fresh fruit, to the imperial palace on a daily basis without spoilage. Marco Polo's auditing of these stations, conducting inventories, and inspecting the grain rations of the horses in his capacity as a Semeran inspector, constituted one of the most incomprehensible datasets he would recount upon his return to the Venetian Republic. While Europe perceived the transportation of information from one point to another merely as individual travel, Kublai Khan had transmuted data transmission across a massive continent into a fluid dynamic measured in seconds, synchronizing the biological energy of thousands of living beings. This nervous system, coordinating the economic volume of paper money, Chao, and the thermodynamic energy of coal, black stones, simultaneously, served as the software flawlessly operating the empire's hardware. This engineering and bureaucratic supremacy of China would also obliterate Europe's mythological beliefs regarding the decryption of the material world's secrets. The chemical reactions of subterranean minerals would force phenomena deemed supernatural to confront laboratory reality. The natural sciences and material perception of 13th century Europe were confined within the dogmatic boundaries of theological texts and the encyclopedias of mythical beasts known as bestiaries. In the minds of European elites and the clergy, the physical properties of substances in nature were interpreted not as chemical structures, but as divine or demonic miracles. The most tangible manifestation of this mythological mindset was the origin attributed to the textiles known as fireproof cloth, exhibited as priceless luxuries within the courts of Europe. The European scholars of the era held it as absolute truth that this incombustible fabric was woven from the wool of the legendary salamander, a mythical, lizard-like beast believed to dwell within the flames, feed upon fire, and possess fire-resistant skin. To Europe, this cloth was proof of a zoological miracle and alchemy. However, Marco Polo, the Samuran inspector of the Yuan dynasty, shattered this centuries-old European mythology with sheer geological and chemical reality during his audit expedition to the Chingantalas, Irtish mines in the far western provinces of the empire, within the modern-day Xinjiang region. The reports compiled by Marco Polo established with laboratory certitude that the fireproof cloth was not the fleece of a mythical beast, but rather the industrial byproduct of a fibrous mineral known in modern geology as asbestos, amphibole/chrysotile minerals, extracted in veins from the depths of the mountains much like coal or copper. The dispatches detailed with forensic rigor how the mineral, once extracted from the earth, was pulverized in massive mortars, and how the fibers were subjected to a highly specialized washing process to separate the residual rock and soil. These isolated, microscopic crystalline fibers were then spun akin to sheep's wool and woven into cloth upon looms. By virtue of the extraordinary refractory, incombustible and heat-resistant properties afforded by the crystalline structure of asbestos, garments or linens fashioned from this fabric were not washed with water when soiled. They were cast directly into a roaring fire, while the organic impurities and oils upon the fabric were incinerated to ash. The asbestos cloth, composed of inorganic mineral fibers, emerged from the flames immaculately white and purified. Marco Polo recorded this thermal purification process not as a mythological illusion, but as a standard industrial procedure of inorganic chemistry and mineralogy. Thus, the European legend of the salamander suffered an intellectual collapse in the face of Asian mining engineering. Yet the shock of vision Asia inflicted upon Europe in the realm of material science was not confined to asbestos. The true, monumental technological chasm lay within the ceramic kilns where the molecular structure of the earth was reconstructed by fire. In 13th century Europe, culinary vessels and storage containers consisted primarily of primitive, porous, heavy, and coarse terracotta, baked earth, ceramics, fired at low temperatures and requiring perpetual glazing to prevent liquid seepage. The thermodynamic capacity of European kilns was utterly incapable of reaching the temperatures necessary to completely melt the chemical bonds of the clay. In stark contrast, within industrial centers such as Dehua in Fujian province or Jingdezhen in the south, Marco Polo encountered a flawless innovation that Europe would expend fortunes and dispatch spies to reverse engineer for centuries. Porcelain. The manufacturing mechanics behind Chinese porcelain was not a haphazard handicraft, but an impeccable material science predicated on the reactions exhibited by specific minerals at precise thermal thresholds. The raw material of porcelain was derived by micrometrically grinding and homogeneously blending white kaolin clay, which possessed a high concentration of aluminum silicate and bore the chemical formula with the feldspar mineral known as petunce, porcelain stone. The definitive point of departure from European ceramics, however, was the thermal capacity achieved by the colossal dragon kilns in which this mixture was fired. By controlling the oxygen flow, creating a reduction atmosphere within these massive tunnel kilns built on the inclines of mountain slopes, Chinese engineers elevated the internal temperature to a threshold between 1,200 degrees Celsius and 1,400 degrees Celsius, reaching the level of white heat. Under this extreme thermal pressure, the feldspar mineral within the clay melted into liquid glass, permeating all microscopic voids between the kaolin particles. Once this molecular fusion process, termed vitrification in material science, was complete, the material emerging from the kiln was no longer ordinary baked earth. It was an entirely novel, hybrid substance possessing a water absorption rate reduced to zero, exhibiting absolute resistance to acids and bases. The product the Venetian inspector held in his hands was a flawless marvel of engineering. Unlike Europe's thick, matte, and coarse clay vessels, it measured mere millimeters in thickness, was translucent enough to reveal the light behind it and the shadows of the fingers holding it when raised to the sun, and produced a long metallic resonance akin to a crystal goblet when struck with a coin. The incombustible weave of asbestos and the vitreous elegance of porcelain stood as tangible proof that the empire administered by Kublai Khan had conquered not only political boundaries, but the physical and chemical limits of nature itself. The macroeconomy of paper money, Chao, the thermodynamic violence of coal, black stones, the intelligence velocity of the Yuan postal network, and the vitrification technology of porcelain, all these elements constituted a colossal data set that Europe could not even begin to fathom in that era. When Marco Polo embarked on his ships to return to Venice, following his 24-year Asian deployment, what he loaded was not merely silk or spices. It was this radical corpus of data destined to uproot all of Europe's geopolitical, economic, and technological dogmas. This immense database would, in the ensuing years, be transcribed onto paper within a cell in a Genoese prison, reproduced by printing presses, reshape the tables of cartographers, and ultimately transform into the definitive navigational guide kept at the bedside of a mariner named Christopher Columbus as he sailed into the darkness of the ocean in the year 1492. In the autumn of 1295, the physical appearance of the three men who set foot upon the cobblestone piers of the Venetian lagoon had completely severed ties with the classical European merchant profile. Having completed a logistical operation across the massive terrestrial landmass of Asia over 24 years, stretching from the hypoxic peaks of the Pamir Mountains to the thermodynamic violence of the Taklamakan Desert, and ultimately into the Samuran bureaucracy of Kublai Khan, Niccolo, Maffeo, and Marco Polo returned to their homeland. Donning worn, coarsely woven Mongol/Tatar garments, and speaking a Venetian dialect, heavily veiled by an Asian accent, due to 24 years of isolation, they were not even recognized by their own blood relatives, greeted instead as strangers presumed dead on the Asian steppes years prior, denied entry to their family estate and compelled to prove their identities. The Polo family's method of verification, as recorded in the historical annals of the era, was an objective and forensic spectacle rooted not in Europe's feudal law, but directly in the condensed capital accumulation of Asia. During a dinner banquet to which the Venetian intelligentsia and members of the Polo family were invited, the three merchants laid their coarse and tattered Tatar robes upon the table, proceeding to slice through the thick seams and linings of the garments with sharp knives, exhibiting millimeter precision. Over the course of their perilous return journey, spanning years and thousands of kilometers, a colossal Asian fortune had been directly integrated into the internal architecture of these textiles to evade border patrols, marauding bandit hordes, and customs officials. As the seams were unraveled, massive cabochon rubies extracted from the mines of Badakhshan, sapphires originating from Ceylon, Sri Lanka, Indian diamonds, and emeralds began to cascade onto the table. The moment this colossal capital, converted into the highest value materials of Asia, yet logistically the most easily transportable and volumetrically the smallest, struck the optical perception of the Venetians at the table, the identity of the Polo family, and the credibility of their 24-year Asian deployment were unequivocally certified through a mathematical declaration of wealth. However, this massive accumulation of capital and the unparalleled statistical database Marco Polo carried within his mind would not be processed in Venice under prolonged conditions of peace. By the year 1298, the maritime and commercial equilibrium in the Mediterranean basin of Europe was being convulsed by the violent kinetic energy of a relentless war for hegemony between the two great Italian maritime republics, Venice, La Serenissima, and Genoa, La Superba. This war was no mere diplomatic dispute. It was a life or death struggle aimed at seizing absolute monopoly over the silk, spice, and grain trade stretching from the Crimean ports in the Black Sea to the Levant corridor of the Eastern Mediterranean, pushing the military-industrial capacities within the massive shipyards, arsenale, of both factions to their absolute limits. When the Venetian Republic received intelligence that the Genoese fleet had infiltrated the Adriatic Sea directly into Venice's backyard, it summoned all its noble merchants and civilian vessels for military mobilization to join the navy. Marco Polo, who had outfitted his own galley and assumed the command, sopra comito, of this vessel using his massive fortune, joined the fleet to confront the logistical and strategic reality of war, this time not on the steppes of Asia, but in the saline waters of the Adriatic. The naval engagement that transpired on September 8, 1298, in the narrow and windswept waters of the Gulf of Korčula, off the coast of modern-day Croatia, served as the theatre for one of the most intense and ruthless tactical collisions in maritime history. The Venetian fleet, comprising approximately 95 galleys under the command of Andrea Dandolo, confronted the Genoese armada of 78 galleys, led by the brilliant admiral Lamba Doria. The geographical anatomy of the Gulf of Korčula, with its narrow straits and abruptly shifting winds, the Bora and Sirocco currents, constituted a profoundly restrictive and lethal arena for galley maneuvers. Despite a numerical disadvantage, Genoese Admiral Lamba Doria seized the tactical initiative from the very onset by harnessing the propulsive force of the wind at his back and concealing an elite reserve fleet of 15 galleys beyond the line of sight. The mechanics of 13th century naval warfare relied not upon ranged artillery fire, but directly upon the kinetic energy of the vessels, the momentum of ramming, and hand-to-hand infantry combat. Accelerated by the advantage of the wind, the massive wooden rams at the prows of the Genoese galleys struck the broadsides of the Venetian ships with immense momentum. The cacophony of splintering oak and pine timbers merged with the chemical devastation wrought by incendiary pitch and unslaked lime powder hurled from catapults. The attack of Lambadoria's concealed reserve fleet against the flanks of the Venetian armada, executed with impeccable timing, entirely collapsed the Venetian formation and transmuted the battle into a colossal maritime slaughter. The Venetian fleet lost over 70 galleys and thousands of sailors. The fleet's admiral, Andrea Dandolo, repeatedly smashed his own head against the mainmast of his ship, committing suicide to avoid the dishonor of captivity. Amidst this massive military catastrophe and the floating piles of splintered wood, Marco Polo, fighting aboard his own galley, was captured alive by Genoese infantrymen and reduced to the status of a prisoner of war. Thousands of captured Venetian soldiers and aristocrats were chained within the holds of the Genoese galleys and transported from the Adriatic to the Ligurian Sea on the western coast of Italy, directly into Genoa, the heart of the enemy. The facility where Marco Polo was incarcerated was the Palazzo San Giorgio prison, the administrative and military epicenter of the Genoese Republic of the era, notorious for its thick stone walls, dimly lit cells, and isolated architecture. This Venetian technocrat, who had served as an imperial inspector for 24 years in the most magnificent palaces of Asia, and within megacities inhabited by millions, was now confined within the boundaries of a damp stone cell, measuring merely a few square meters. However, this physical isolation would function not as a historical tragedy, but as a mechanical trigger, initiating one of the greatest intellectual explosions in history. For the Genoese prison authorities did not place Marco Polo in an empty cell, but alongside another high-profile prisoner who had already been serving his sentence in that very cell for years. The writer Rustichello da Pisa, a citizen of the Pisan Republic. The reason for Rustichello da Pisa's presence in this cell was his capture exactly 14 years prior to the Battle of Curzola, during the Battle of Meloria in 1284, a naval engagement between the Genoese and Pisan fleets that resulted in the total annihilation of Pisa's maritime power. Rustichello was no simple soldier or merchant. He was a professional man of letters who authored French chivalric romances centered around the legends of King Arthur, the Knights of the Round Table, and the Holy Grail, works immensely popular in the European courts of the era. Thus, this narrow and damp dungeon cell was transmuted into a massive laboratory where two diametrically opposed mindsets and two divergent universes collided in an unprecedented manner. On one side of the cell stood a Venetian state inspector who processed the world through data and logistical statistics, harboring in his mind the trade routes of the Asian continent, the thermodynamic capacity of coal, the inflationary equations of paper currency, the station distances of the Yam postal network, and the tax quotas of Kublai Khan's Samuran bureaucracy. On the other side sat a Pisan novelist, wielding the literary formulas, mythological tropes, exaggerated combat descriptions of the era, and the algorithms that dictated the reading habits of the European intelligentsia. Through clandestine channels to his family in Venice, Marco Polo managed to have his personal notes, intelligence ledgers, and logistical journals, which he had brought from Asia and recorded throughout his expedition, smuggled into the prison. With the arrival of these documents in the cell, the greatest intercontinental data leak of the pre-printing press era of human history commenced. As Marco Polo began to dictate the cold, mathematical, and colossal reality of Asia, step by step, city by city, from behind iron bars, relying upon his notes and his flawless memory, Rustichello de Pisa commenced transcribing this raw data onto parchment using iron gall ink and a quill. Yet this dictation process was no passive secretarial act. By filtering Polo's dry statistics and geographical coordinates through his chivalric romance lens, Rustichello cast the text into a literary form in Franco-Italian, a hybridization of French vocabulary and the Venetian northern Italian dialect, the accepted lingua franca, readable by the European aristocracy of the era. Had it not been for the military defeat at Curzola and the unforgiving prison conditions of Genoa, the Asia within the mind of Marco Polo, who would likely have ended his days as a wealthy Venetian merchant, was, through this cellular captivity, transmuted into ink, parchment, and ultimately, a database destined to alter the world. The months-long dictation process within the dimly lit, damp, and isolated dungeon cell of the Palazzo San Giorgio yielded one of the most extraordinary philological case studies of the pre-Gutenberg era in human history. The raw statistics imparted by Marco Polo, relying upon his personal ledgers, commercial journals secretly procured from the Venetian archives, and his absolute memory, were transcribed onto parchment via the quill of the writer Rustichello de Pisa. However, during this mechanical transfer of information, the texture of the text underwent a radical mutation through the collision of two divergent mindsets. Polo was a cold state inspector who calculated distances in days, expressed units of goods in standard weights, and reported tax quotas, bridge counts, silk production volumes, and customs tariffs with mathematical precision. In contrast, Rustichello was a novelist specializing in the legends of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, prone to embellishing battles and chivalric tournaments with hyperbolic adjectives. As the objective geopolitical and logistical data of Asia provided by Polo filtered through Rustichello's mind, it was subjected to literary manipulation. The tactical maneuvers of Tatar armies were depicted akin to classical chivalric clashes, and the bureaucratic structure of Asian courts was draped in a romantic veil of grandeur. The synthesis of these two opposing mindsets caused the work, originally titled Devisement du Monde, Description of the World, to assume a dual-layered code in Franco-Italian, a synthetic amalgamation of the northern Italian dialects and Old French of the era. While the text served, on one hand, as the most rigorous economic intelligence dossier of Asia, it simultaneously projected an illusion of fiction in the eyes of the European intelligentsia due to the literary veneer in which it was encased. In the late 13th and early 14th century Europe, where the printing press had not yet been invented, the replication of information was not a mechanical operation, but an entirely biological and manual process. Once the original parchment text penned in the cell leaked beyond the prison walls, it was manually reproduced as manuscript copies by clergymen in monasteries, scribes of the nobility, and apprentices of merchant guilds, laboring for months by candlelight. However, the process termed by the discipline of paleography as the stemmatic copying error intervened. During transcription, individual scribes misread certain words, altered specific numerical figures, or deliberately expunged geographical details that contradicted their own theological convictions. Consequently, By the time the book reached the courts, duchies, and universities of Europe, it had metamorphosed into a massive accumulation of data possessing dozens of variant editions. The book's initial true collision with the scholastic and feudal mindset of Europe culminated in a profound intellectual collapse of comprehension. The European cosmography of the era was defined by TO maps, which derived their authority from the dogmas of the Church and positioned Jerusalem at their absolute center. Yet, the power situated at the center of Marco Polo's book was the realm of Cathay, China, ruled by Kublai Khan, a non-Christian, pagan, absolute military superpower located tens of thousands of kilometers to the east of Europe, possessing wealth exponentially greater than the sum of all European kingdoms combined. This geopolitical reality was perceived by the European intelligentsia as a theological threat and an intolerable humiliation. The magnitude of the scholastic rejection was not confined merely to geographical positioning. It devolved into a systematic mechanism of denial directed against the technological and material supremacy of Asia. While Europe's contracting economy remained rigidly tethered to the dogma of bullionism, wherein only gold and silver ores possessing physical weight held value, the paper currency, Chao system, detailed in the book, manufactured from the bark of mulberry trees and bearing vermilion seals, was dismissed as an irrational alchemical fabrication. In an Europe teetering on the precipice of a deforestation crisis, where wood was exclusively utilized for heating and industry, the existence of black stones, coal, extracted from beneath the earth, burning significantly longer and at a much higher caloric output than charcoal, was labeled an anomaly that contradicted the Aristotelian physics and material science of the epoch. Similarly, within a demographic reality, where the population of Paris, Europe's largest metropolis, hovered around 150,000, where raw sewage flowed through the streets and cholera epidemics were accepted as commonplace. The Asian megacities described by Marco Polo, such as Cambalik, Beijing, and Quinsay, Hangzhou, inhabited by millions and featuring grid-planned avenues, colossal bridges, and stone-paved subterranean sewer systems, constituted an incomprehensible science fiction fantasy for European urban planners and administrators. Furthermore, the book's articulation, with laboratory exactitude, that the precious fabrics European elites mistook for the wool of the legendary salamander because they did not burn in fire was in fact a fibrous mineral, asbestos, extracted from the Chingintala's mines in Asia, decimated the bestiary, encyclopedias of animal mythology, literature that guided Europe's natural sciences. Yet, scholastic hubris shelved this scientific reality as well, branding it either heresy or fabrication. When the manuscripts filtered down from the high aristocracy to the commercial piazzas of Venice and Genoa, reaching the plebeian strata, this collapse of comprehension transformed into sociological mockery. A specific lexicon employed continuously by Marco Polo throughout the text to convey the massive scales of Asia anchored the epicenter of this reaction. Polo repeatedly utilized the word million, milione, when recounting Kublai Khan's tax revenues, the volume of silk bales passing through customs, the number of troops in the military, and the transport vessels on the Yangtze River. In the daily life and commerce of 13th century Europe, the concept of a million possessed no functional equivalent. In an era where merchants transacted in the thousands or, at most, tens of thousands, it was an astronomical and absurd magnitude reserved solely for theoretical mathematics. The mind of a Venetian citizen could not rationally process the simultaneous navigation of tens of thousands of ships upon a single river, or a state injecting paper currency valued at millions of gold pieces into circulation. Rather than accepting the primitive and marginal status of their own civilization, in the face of such a colossal technological, economic, and demographic powerhouse, human psychology and mass sociology opted for the simplest defense mechanism to overcome this cognitive dissonance: denial and mockery. The Venetian populace branded these Asian statistics recounted by Marco Polo as the product of systematic deceit, christening the book with the vernacular moniker Il Milione, the million lies. This sociological backlash escalated to such proportions that Marco Polo himself began to be addressed in the streets as Marco Milione, Marco of the millions / Marco the liar. However, while the theologians and the common populace of the era relegated this data to the category of fairy tales through scholastic arrogance and sociological denial, another highly pragmatic, silent, and calculating class, laboring in the dark and isolated chambers of Europe, began to place the mathematical coordinates hidden between the lines of this book upon their desks, embarking on the task of redrawing the physical map of the world. The stigmatization of Marco Polo's text in the public eye as a collection of fairy tales or an instance of charlatanism failed to prevent the infiltration of the book's logistical data into the pragmatic production and commercial centers of Europe. While Il Milione could serve as an object of ridicule for church authorities, shaped by theological dogmas and broad public masses devoid of rational intellect, for the merchant guilds in Genoese, Venetian, and Catalan ports, and the cartographers in royal courts, this text functioned as a covert technical manual opening unto the vast riches of Asia. The manuscript copies of the book were extracted from the secluded shelves of palace libraries and transported to the operational tables where merchants planned their trade routes, and to the ateliers where cartographers constructed their depictions of the New World. This silent revolution laid the foundations of a radical paradigm within Europe's geopolitical mind, establishing that Marco Polo's statistical data were not theological myths, but rather traceable and accessible routing data. In the cartographic discipline of the 14th century, the work titled Description of the World began to be accepted as a geographical point of reference. The most tangible proof of this transformation is the Catalan Atlas, prepared in 1375 by Abraham Cresques, the renowned cartographer of the Kingdom of Majorca. Oceanic maps, where Spanish cartographers had previously left the eastern extremity of the Asian continent, or its ports opening to the ocean, as mere voids filled with mythological creatures, terra incognita, began to be populated with the coordinates, city names and trade routes provided by Marco Polo. Cresques inscribed Quinsay, Hangzhou, Canbalik, Beijing, and the provincial capitals where Marco Polo had personally served, directly from the pages of the book onto his parchments with mathematical fidelity. The cartographer illustrated these cities not merely as dots, but with tower depictions reflecting the economic volume of the era, and lines tracing the routes of merchant caravans, thereby certifying that Asia was no longer a mythical continent, but a concrete commercial target upon which strategic operations would be conducted. This covert navigation characteristic of the book became the greatest intelligence source for duchies and mercantile states harboring the desire to reach the East amid the feudal fragmentation of Europe. The fundamental inquiry evolved from the theological debates of the Middle Ages regarding what exists in the East to how to get there. Marco Polo's text transmuted the lengths of coastlines, the navigability of rivers, and the distance data between major cities into data inputs for the primitive compasses and astrolabes of the era. Nautical guides, specifically those replicated in port cities and known as portolan charts, began to incorporate the descriptions regarding the eastern coasts of Asia recounted by Polo. Thus, the data dictated by a Venetian merchant in a prison cell acquired the status of an intelligence dossier that reconfigured the maritime strategy of Europe. The cartographic endeavors conducted over this text were fueled not solely by an impulse for geographical discovery, but simultaneously by an economic imperative. The Ottoman Empire's tightening of commercial control over the Levant and the Silk Road in the 15th century, which escalated the costs of traditional trade routes, forged a consensus among European states on the objective to reach Asia by sea. It was precisely at this juncture that Marco Polo's figures, previously branded as lies, attained the value of a geopolitical compass. The famous world map, prepared by the cartographer Fra Mauro in 1450, centralized the Asian depictions within Polo's book, to such an extent that the Asian continent was rendered upon the map as broader and more detailed than Europe and Africa combined. These maps were not merely geographical depictions, but simultaneously manifestos of vision, for this data constituted the sole technical documentation required to transport Europe's inwardly trapped feudal destiny to the massive markets beyond the oceans. Marco Polo's text became the decisive element determining the victor in this silent war between the rejection of the scholastic world and the pragmatic merchant mind's appetite for discovery. Although the book continued to bear the moniker Marco of the Millions as a subject of public mockery, it persisted in functioning as a routing guide destined to determine the future of Europe upon the operational desks of port captains, cartographers, and statesmen. Its pages worn by handwritten notes, its margins replete with commercial calculations, the foundation underlying humanity's shift toward perceiving the world not merely as a center of belief, but as a calculable and explorable realm of commercial data, lies within this very manuscript, copied thousands of times, translated across languages, and read with increasing fervor the more it was denounced as a lie. This data leak triggered the process that would terminate the intellectual darkness into which Europe had plunged, heralding a new dawn sought across the ocean. So much so that a mariner would not only seek gold and spices within the lines of this book, but would also carry alongside him a colossal margin of error destined to permanently alter the trajectory of a civilization. In August of 1492, the strategic expedition of the three-ship fleet that set sail into the ocean from the port of Palos, altering the course of history, was not, contrary to popular narrative, a coincidental oceanic voyage. It was a navigational project engineered to reach a destination thousands of kilometers away, built directly upon Marco Polo's data. The 1485 Latin copy of Marco Polo's work, which rested upon Christopher Columbus's desk and is preserved today within the Columbina Library in Seville, Spain, served as the technical document of this project. The 366 marginalia notes, inscribed by Columbus's own hand upon the pages of this book, reveal, with forensic exactitude, the motivation behind the expedition, the targeted geography, and the depiction of Asia within the mariner's mind. As Columbus sailed into the ocean, he possessed no objective to discover a new continent. His aim was to reach directly by sea, following a westward route, the island of Cipangu, Japan, whose roofs were allegedly covered in gold, as mentioned in Polo's descriptions, and the empire of Cathay, China, the world's largest production center, governed by the Great Khan. The greatest error in Columbus's navigational strategy stemmed from his gross miscalculation of the distance between the eastern extremity of the Asian continent and the western coast of Europe, resulting from the erroneous correlation of the statistical data contained within the book with his own geopolitical ambitions. In Polo's texts, the travel times and distance estimates between ports were provided not according to the cruising speeds of the era's ships or oceanic currents, but based upon the arduous topography of the caravan routes. Utilizing this data, Columbus calculated the continental breadth of Asia to be vastly larger and the expanse of the ocean to be significantly narrower than they actually were. In the marginal notes of the book, he fixed the circumference of the Earth at a value even smaller than the figures provided by Ptolemy and other ancient geographers. Thus, he conceptualized the Atlantic Ocean as a far more navigable barrier than it existed in reality. When the Santa Maria set sail into the ocean in 1492, equipped with technical instruments such as the compass and astrolabe, alongside this manuscript brimming with Polo's descriptions of Asia, the mariner carried within him the dream not of an undiscovered world, but of that inaccessible Cathay recounted by Polo. The rhythm of maintaining a logbook aboard the ship throughout the maritime voyage stands as the greatest testament to Columbus's absolute devotion to the data within Polo's book. With each passing day, as the crew approached the threshold of mutiny, as water supplies dwindled and no land appeared, Columbus reread the relevant sections of the book, noting that they were drawing closer to those Asian shores of boundless wealth described by Polo. When he set foot upon the Caribbean islands in October of 1492, the emotion he experienced upon encountering the indigenous populace was not profound astonishment, but rather a mechanism of confirmation. Columbus attempted to correlate the garments of the natives he observed, the simple adornments they utilized, and the geography of the islands with the depictions of Cathay found within Marco Polo's book. As he gazed upon the gold trinkets of the indigenous people, he sought traces of the immense wealth of Kublai Khan's palace, convincing himself that he had discovered the Chinese Empire located thousands of kilometers away. Until the end of his life, Columbus operated under the unwavering conviction that the lands he had discovered were an inaccessible fragment of the Asia recounted by Polo, that the indigenous people were subjects of the Great Khan, and that he would reach the golden domes of the palace at a very proximate coordinate. Although the ultimate destination of this expedition was geographically not Asia, but a new continent that history had never before accounted for, this outcome does not alter the reality that a text authored concerning Asia fundamentally changed the destiny of the Americas. The raw data set that Marco Polo synthesized with a novelist's quill in a damp cell within a Genoese prison became not merely a text confined to paper, but a trajectory of destiny engraved into the compass and mind of a mariner. This intercontinental data leak, which infiltrated the logistical, economic, and technological realities of Asia into Europe, stands as the paramount proof of how a manuscript could alter the world with mechanical certainty in an era before the printing press reached the masses. When the notes recorded by a Venetian merchant in the megacities of Asia crashed onto a beach across the Atlantic in 1492, the greatest legends and geographical realities of history were definitively united between the pages of Marco Polo's book, perpetually shattering the closed feudal world of Europe outward. That brings us to the end of our video. Thank you for joining us for tonight's story. If you enjoyed it and want to see more content like this, please don't forget to like and subscribe. We would also love to hear your ideas and suggestions in the comments, so we can keep creating even better content for you. Hope to see you in the next video.